Ma'am, shall I start? Flesh forgets, bone remembers. Quote by Jefferson Bus. On this note, a very warm good morning and a heartily welcome to all for the second guest lecture of the expert lecture series of this academic year titled Forensic Aspects in Disaster Victim Identification. Prayer should be the key of the day and the lock of the night. If prayer becomes a habit, success becomes a lifestyle. With these thoughts, we will begin this expert lecture by invoking God's blessings. I request the Christu Jayanti College choir to lead us in a prayer song.
You made the mountains and the sea, measured all the universe, and you made me. Echoes of the voice that called the words to be, reach throughout the ages and now speak to me. You my creator king. You who made the valleys and the skies, displayed your love on far horizons and before my eyes. You who lit the stars and set the dawn in time, call them all by name, and now you whisper mine. You're my creator king. And who am I that you are mindful of me? And who am I that you sent your love on me? And who am I that you are mindful of me? And who am I that you sent your love on me? You're my creator king.
We are delighted to welcome Ms. Hansi Bansal as speaker for the expert lecture series. Ma'am, we deem it an honor to have you in our midst. We thank you for accepting our invitation. We welcome you, ma'am. I also welcome Professor Don Cairo, the coordinator of the Department of Forensic Science, to this session. Welcome, sir. I cordially welcome the faculty members of the department and thank them for their hard work and dedication towards everyday progress in the department. Welcome, ma'ams and sirs. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to the session's participants, our dear students from the Department of Forensic Science. We hope that this session will enlighten you and provide you with deeper insights with disaster victim identification investigation. Welcome, all of you. Without further ado, I request Dr. Suchita Rawat, Assistant Professor, to introduce the chief guest for today's lecture.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Hansi Bansal is an academician and researcher. Ma'am is a certified handwriting analysis specialist and certified signature analysis specialist. Currently, Ma'am is working as Assistant Professor Forensic Science at the Government Institute of Forensic Science, Nagpur. Ma'am has over 10 years of experience in teaching and research. Ma'am has also worked as forensic analyst at HCL Infosys Limited in GK Consultancy for UIDAI project under Planning Commission of India, Government of India. Ma'am's research interest includes fingerprints, question documents, handwriting analysis, crime scene investigation and reconstruction, forensic anthropology, physical anthropology, and microbial forensics. Ma'am is a member of Indian Science Congress Association in Kolkata, West Bengal, as well as the National Conference on Forensic Science, an interface between science, law, and justice. MAM also serves as reviewer for Forensic Science International Journal, Elsevier publication, Egyptian Journal of Forensic Science, Springer publication, and Science and Justice, Elsevier publication. MAM has authored research papers in reputed international journals. With this reputed career, we feel it an honor to have Madam in our midst to address the second talk on expert lecture series of this academic year. I now request Ma'am to address the gathering.
Thank you so much, Suchita ma'am, for the warm introduction. Shall I begin my screen?
Yes, ma'am, you can slideshow. You can share the screen and then we can go ahead with your presentation.
Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. First of all, a warm good morning to one and all present over here. And thank you, Christu Jayanti College and all the members present over here who have invited me to address the students. So it is a pleasure for me to share my thoughts on this topic with the students over there. All right. So the topic is forensic aspects in disaster victim identification. So before going into the detail of the forensic aspects, first of all, we should have a basic understanding of what a disaster is and what is the need of identifying the victim in a disaster. So by International Red Cross Society, the word disaster, or when we are saying disaster victim identification, so the word disaster is defined as it is a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or society and causes human, material, and economic or environmental loss that exceed the community's or society's ability to cope using its own resources. So within this definition, there are different aspects. That is, due to that event or due to that calamity, it disrupts the functioning of either a community or a society, or it causes material loss, human loss, economic loss, and severe environmental loss. So if we move to the second definition, or a paraphrase of the first definition, that is a community or a society where that this loss or this disaster has occurred. A disaster in a particular community may not be a disaster to another community in certain cases. For example, it says that a disaster is any incident that results in loss of life or property that exceeds a community's resources and its ability to respond. So, if a less developed nation or a lower developed society uh, with less resources faces a disaster and they have lesser resources to respond to it, so that may be a disaster or a calamity in that particular society. But a higher developed nation which is able to cope up with that particular calamity may not be a disaster in that case for that particular community. So basically, the major loss that occurs is due for human, economic, environmental, and material loss. Now, when we talk about disaster victim identification, it refers to the component of fatality management. So, when we are saying victim identification, so first of all, the identity, the victims are to be identified. Victims of the disaster or a calamity are to identified, and the next step that comes is the management of the dead. That is how those dead bodies that are recovered from a disaster site, how they are managed, and that all has to be done using a scientific process. So it deals with scientific identification of human remains. Now, there are different types of disasters that occur. So if we classify on the basis of how they occur, how they are occurring, or how they are happening, so it can be classified as two: natural and man-made. So if we talk about natural disaster, it can include hurricanes, floods, volcanic eruptions, or bushfires, tsunamis, landslides, epidemics, pandemics, etc. All these comes under natural disasters where there is not much involvement directly of human beings, which lead to the cause of that particular disaster. Now, man-made disaster can be intentional or it can be unintentional. Now, if we talk about certain accidental damages, or for example, chemical explosions or certain leakages in factories which result in a mass fatality, or some radiation accidents which are unintentional, though that has resulted because of humans, but that are considered as unintentional man-made disasters. Or if we talk about intentional man-made disasters, that includes terrorism. It can be biological, chemical, radiological, nuclear, or explosive terrorism. Now, if we divide, or if we talk about the types of disasters on the basis of the victims, the first classification, the types that we talked about, was how they are occurring or the cause of their occurrence. And if we talk about the victims of a particular disaster, it can be said as an open disaster, where we are not aware that who all are the victims. Now, for example, if you see the figure, you can see the first uh, picture represents an earthquake site, and the second picture represents a flood site. So in both these cases, the area affected is large. All both of them are examples of natural disasters. In this case, we do not have a fixed set of victims, or we are not sure about the names of the victims, or only these many people will be the victim of this particular disaster. So where the victims are not known, or the victim is in such a huge number where the exact number or the names cannot be identified, that is said as an open disaster. Now, if we talk about a closed disaster, majorly the names of the victims, or at least we have a number that how many victims are there. For example, the first picture talk about a airplane crash, represents an airplane crash. So where in a plane, the airline will have the number of people who would have boarded the plane. Or if in the second picture we see, if a ship goes missing, so these authorities will have a list of people who all would have boarded the plane, or who all would have boarded the ship. So here, at least identifying. So if we are looking for the victim, or if we are looking for the missing person, we are aware that for whom are we looking for. So that is why these types of disasters are said as closed disasters, where the victims names, or we do not say that we are not sure that for whom are we looking for. So this is said as a closed disaster. Now, what is the, though we have many requirements why this human identification should be done, but what are the major for human identification? The first important thing that we talk about, that why is there a need for human identification, is from a humanitarian aspect, that is to give a closure to the family of the grieved. So that is, if the person in a this disaster, if a person goes missing, so the loved ones or the relatives or the family members are always in a hope, unless and until the dead body, or in whatever condition the remains are recovered or are found. So if the body goes missing, they are always in a hope that somewhere or the other the person may be alive. So at least if when proper positive identification is done, the family will get a closure that the person is no more, or they will accept this belief that the person is no more alive, so they can continue, or that will give a closure to the family member. Another aspect, if we talk about why a positive identification is required, that is to settle business and personal affairs, or if it is regarding like parents. So the child custody only can be given once the positive identification is done. So that also may be delayed if this identification is not done. Or if we talk about criminal investigations, if the positive identification of a victim is not done or the victim is not identified, the criminal investigation in that particular case may be delayed. So these are a few of the basic need for which human identification is done. The primary thing is to identify the role of medical examiner. What are the roles that a medical examiner should be doing uh, at a disaster site, or what all important functions they have to play in a case of disaster? The first is recovery of victims, that is, locating and recovering the body fragments and documenting the scene and then transporting those remains to the mortuary. Or if there's a case of if there are case of like radioactive material or a biological weapon, so decontaminating that area or uh, that particular zone or that particular remain, it is also important before sending the body or the remains to the mortuary. Another is an assessment to determine the cause and manner of death. So it is important to identify. Now, for example, in case in if you're not talking about a Mars disaster, also if an unidentified body is found, so after the inquest, the basic thing is to determine the cause and manner of the death. Another, the identification and issuing of the death certificate. So when by using a scientific method, identification is done, not just by visually examining it. And the last role is like how the body should be disposed of. In this case, in this the last step, once the body is also identified, the remains are identified, that a positive identification is done. Another thing is how the body should be disposed. In cases where there are no relatives or family members of the dead, so how they should be disposed, how the body should be disposed of, that is an important aspect. Now, coming to the process of DVI. In 1984, first, the Interpol published the first DVI manual. So what was the purpose of publishing this DVI manual was to provide certain rules or protocols or that should be uniform, that how a mass disaster should be handled or how the identification process should be done, so that that could increase the effectiveness of victim identification in a disaster. So in general, when we say it includes three basic steps. First is the recovery. So after a disaster site is found, at a disaster site, the first important thing is recovery of the remains or identifying if there are alive victims and providing medical assistance to them. And another next is search for antemortem information for possible victims. So the basic thing that is important for a positive identification is having the antemortem data. So how a positive identification is done by comparing the antemortem data with the postmortem data. So in many of the cases where antemortem data is missing, so if there are relatives or known people of the ones who have died, then the antemortem data of those people are taken or collected by maybe a survey or by making a questionnaire. The data is collected from them, and then possible identification is done. And the last is comparison of antemortem and postmortem data. So, like for example, when we say how a crime scene is processed, after reaching the crime scene, the first thing is you are thoroughly searching the crime scene for evidence. So here in case of a disaster site, first of all, an accurate map of the disaster site should be acquired and it should be thoroughly searched and properly photographed and documented. Then it should be searched systematically for the recovery of the body and what all evidences may be found and identification of the victim. So as per the Interpol, they have separate forms or like they have given a specific color to them yellow and pink for obtaining the antemortem data and the postmortem data. And after these two data are collected, this data is present, then a victim identification report is made, and on the basis of which a death certificate is issued. So a provision of death certificate is only after a positive identification is done. So like there are separate teams. The antemortem data obtains the antemortem data from the suspected victims or corresponding missing files, and then conveys accordingly to the authority regarding the identification. And the postmortem team collects the relevant dental, medical, and forensic data from the deceased bodies for the purpose of identification. In the last, after this, the antemortem data and the postmortem data is compared, whether it is matching or not matching for the positive identification. So this is represented in the form of a figure. The first phase one, which talks about scene processing at the disaster site, and phase two is post-mortem examination, that is detailed examination of human remains in mortuary. So this examination will help to assess the actual cause of death, or if there are any injury marks present, or maybe a certain weapon was used, or whatever the cause of death may be. Phase 3 talks about the antemortem data, that is collection of missing person. Now, this antemortem data can be obtained from the previous dental records, antemortem dental records, or DNA, or through some databases like fingerprints may be collected. So all this is useful for the purpose of comparison. Phase 4 is reconciliation, that is comparison, matching with postmortem, matching the postmortem data with the antemortem data. And phase 5 talks about debriefing, that is how effective this whole process was and further steps. Now, when we talk about methods of human identification, or in general, when we say how forensic science is employed in this disaster victim identification, there are numerous branches of forensic science that comes into play for human identification. For example, we may use fingerprints, or we may use forensic odontology, or forensic anthropology, or DNA analysis, or forensic genetics as well. So there are like, on a single application, we are not relying. It is a comprehensive process which includes different areas of forensic science for the identification purpose. So majorly, these 5 common methods are employed. The first method that we talk about, visual method. So visual method is a non-scientific approach. So if just by looking at the picture, sorry, not the picture, if we have the person, the dead body of a person present over there. So if the face isn't disfigured, or if you can identify by looking at a person, then an identification may be done. But if you look at this picture on the screen, Victor Yushchenko before and after dioxin poisoning. So this was his actual face, but then he was given a poison. So over the time, his face was getting disfigured. So on medical examination, internally, there wasn't much damage to the organs, but there were visual damage that was appearing on his face. So this method, unless and until it is accompanied along with more scientific approach, this method is not reliable, as it is non-scientific approach. Or if we can say, like for visual examination, if a person having some scars or birthmarks or some tattoo marks that are very unique in nature, may not be very common, or that may help in identification. Now, for example, if a relative or a loved one would have told that a particular tattoo mark or something was written on the hand of a person, or on the forehead, or maybe neck, or wherever the tattoo was made. So if even a fragmented part of the body is found, unless and until the body is, if it is decomposed, then the visual examination does not play much role. Before that stage of decomposition, or Certain changes may occur after the late changes that we talk about after death. For example, decomposition, skeletonization, or mummification. So at these stages, it is not possible to identify by visual method. Another technique, that is dactyloscopy, fingerprints. So if like we all know, these are uh, the ridges present on the epidermis layer. So if this tissue, the soft tissues on the fingertips, if that remain intact, then the fingerprints may be recovered from the dead bodies. And in case of burnt or decomposed, skeletonized, and fragmented remains, it may not be possible to identify or to obtain the fingerprints. Though it is a reliable method and it is a individual character by which 100% accurate identification can be done, provided these prints are present in a position that they can be compared. So, like from the databases, the antemortem prints of the person may be recovered, or these prints obtained from the disaster site may be taken and then they are compared. So if the antemortem, see, one of the disadvantage, or rather loophole, I would say, in all these methods are many of these methods, they cannot work or they will not be useful in accurate identification if the antemortem data records are not available. So, like, even when we say the whole of forensic science, how do we rely on this whole science of forensic? That is, whatever we get from the crime scene in general, when we say, if we are getting for example, here we are talking about fingerprints. So if we get a latent print from the crime scene, we try to process it, we try to develop it so that it is visible. And then having that print from the crime scene is of no use unless you have the prints from the suspect. So only by comparison we are proving that this prints belongs to so and so person or not. So in this case, in case of mass disasters, like, these all techniques become more useful, or they provide reliable identification only when the antemortem data records are available. Another is anthropology. Like again, in anthropology, it can talk about, if we talk about radiology, that is having the x-rays, or nowadays CT scans are used. So even if the body is decomposed or fragmented remains are found, or the whole skeleton is found, again these post-mortem radiographs are compared with the anti-mortem medical imaging or the medical records. Now, if in the figure, if you see, this shows the radiograph of the lower extremity below the hip bone. So, if, for example, if a person has a metallic plate after a fracture inserted in the thigh bone, or maybe the lower extremity, or maybe in the upper extremity bones. So after x-rays, if the radiographs are taken, so that will display how the bone was repaired, or what material or what was inserted inside. So now this actual like, if we say from the individual character perspective, so this can't be if we have the post-mortem record only, this will be of no use unless and until we have an anti-mortem data of a person who had the same surgery, or the radiograph is matching with it. So if the radiographs of the bone anomalies or surgical hardwares, or any unusual or something individual character of a skeleton is found during this radiographs, that may be helpful in identification. Now, another important aspect of anthropology, when we talk about, like, this was if we have the antemortem records or the antemortem radiographs of the person, so we are comparing. But otherwise, if no antemortem records are present, or an unidentified skeletal remain is found. So all the skeletal remains also helps in identification, as in, like, it can help you to may not give you a positive identification, or may not will tell you the actual identity of the person, but then it can help you in narrowing down. So you may be able to determine the sex of a person, or you may be able to determine the ancestry of a person or age of a person. So all this, again, if not a positive identification, but eventually that will narrow down your suspected pool of victims, and that may help in identification. Another is DNA. Everybody knows like how useful it is for positive identification. So again, here it relies more on antemortem data. The degree to which human remains are fragmented or degraded, it determines the value of the DNA analysis. That is, to what extent these remains are fragmented. So if like very small fragments of the bones or the skeleton are found, in that case, it will not be possible to determine like to build up the biological profile. So if from in that case, it is like by DNA, the identification can be done. That is, it is the only viable method. Or if the quantity of DNA is very small, whatever the amount of DNA is extracted, that is very small. So instead of going for nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA or single nucleotide polymorphism is more often used. But one of the disadvantage that we have in this, like for in a mass fatality or in a mass disaster, the number is too large. So it is not economically feasible, as well as it is a time taking process. So it is not possible to like send each and every evidence that may help in getting DNA or extracting DNA or identification through DNA. It is practically impossible to send every sample found on a disaster site for DNA analysis. So if we are accompanying all these methods, or in together the, like, if there is a whole skeletal remain that can be identified by radiograph, then in that case there is no need of going for DNA analysis. So or if a body, if a remain is in such a position that fingerprints can be obtained, that is, it has not been skeletonized. So if fingerprints can be taken from it, so a fingerprint again will help in identification. Another important aspect that is used for identification is dental identification. That is use of forensic odontology. Uh, Now, it is said that it can be used for identifying burnt, decomposed, skeletonized, or fragmented remains, because tooth is like it can survive to a very high temperature, or it can survive to an extensive trauma, or maybe direct heat even. So that stays for a longer duration in spite of these adverse conditions. So that also helps in identification. Now, if we talk about the different aspects that we take into consideration in forensic odontology is like though the number of teeth in every human, in general we say 32 teeth are there. So like everybody may not have the third molar. So the tooth morphology or the dental anomalies, restorations or artificial dental implants or oral pathology, all these are few of the aspects that are used for the comparison purpose. So if we look at this picture, that is a dental implant. So even the manufacturer or of that particular implant, or the material that is used for dental filling, that also helps in the identification, or and it gives a lot more detail about the other aspects other than if not the actual or accurate identification. But again, like for example, in case of anthropology we talked about, it can help you in building the biological profile. Similarly, here again, from odontology, we also can determine the sex of a person, the ancestry of a person, the dietary habits of a person, etc. And again, Here also the radiographs are taken, or the X-rays of the jaws are taken. It is a quick method and quite inexpensive when we're comparing with the DNA. Now, having seen all these methods, different methods, for example, visual, dental, anthropology, odontology, etc. So if we talk like as a hierarchy, if we talk about first, like from the eyewitness reports or the event information, that is by visual recognition or certain associated documents if we get, or certain identification tags are there. Visual recognition we are identifying that give you a lead in proceeding further in the process of identification. Next is, if like I told, if we are not able to determine the actual identity of a person, we may be able to determine the age of a person or the race of a person, sex of a person, stature, healed injuries, or certain congenital condition. That comes under the biological profile of a person. So as we move down, we are narrowing down and then coming for the identification. Next comes the support for identification. So if we have determined, for example, we have determined the age, we have determined the sex of a person or the height of a person. So now along with these biological profile, if we have other support for identification, for example, certain unusual features, for example, such tattoo marks or dental work or piercings, and certain belongings or eyewitness reports that further, like when we say in general, the main evidence and the corroborative evidence. So all these will corroborate again along with the biological profile. And further is the scientific identification that we talked about, like fingerprint analysis, STR-based DNA analysis, odontology, or if we have certain unique medical identifiers. So on the basis of DNA. So as we move down, we see here reduced risk of misidentification. If we rely only on the visual recognition, there are more chances of misidentification. Similarly, if we move further down to determining the biological profile, it reduces the risk. So, in actual sense, when we are relying on the scientific identification, or if we have fingerprint or STR-based DNA analysis or odontology, the chances, we are not saying that there is no chance of misidentification, but it reduces the scientific process of analysis, it reduces the risk of misidentification. Like this, I have already told that if we are not having the antemortem data, we may not be able to provide a positive identification. But it helps you in developing the dental profiling, or it helps to limit the population pool of possible victims. It may help in presumptive identification. So by determining the material that was, or material used for dental filling, we can talk, have an idea regarding the socioeconomic status of a person. Or by looking at the condition of the teeth or the oral pathology, we can talk about the occupation of a person. For example, a person is in a profession of making dresses where you use thread and needle, where the person is using teeth for maybe thread or needle or whatever. So that may help in estimating the occupation of a person, or if a person is suffering with some systemic disease, or it can tell you about the age of a person or the habits. So all these, if not in a accurate or positive identification, but that may help you in a potential identification or minimizing the population pool. Now, among these methods that we talked about, like all these methods are there for positive identification. We have uh, dental odontology or DNA analysis or fingerprints. Like, how do we say that which method is more reliable or which method is more accurate for identification? Now, every disaster is a individual crime scene site or individual site. So a common, though we have certain fixed set of rules and protocols, what should be done, which data should be collected, or how the antemortem data should be obtained, or how the postmortem data should be obtained. But then every disaster or every fatality accident will have its own individual character. So either if there is a possibility that all these methods of identification can be used together, or uh, like if suppose dental records are available, or if the identification can be done by using forensic odontology, then that should be preferred rather than going for DNA analysis. Earlier, see, in India, I feel there may be records, databases for DNA or for fingerprints, but the antemortem dental records may be less available as compared to other countries. So, before this technique of DNA analysis, more this comparison or identification was done more on the basis of dental records. These are few examples where different methods of identification were selected in different types of mass disasters. In UK, and between the year 1985 and 1989, which comprised three air disasters, a capsized ferry, a fire on an oil platform, uh, the 80% of the recovered bodies were identified on the basis of dental records. And in this World Trade Center, this victim fragmentation, it was so extreme that the DNA was used for analysis because there was no possibility of identification using the dental records or the fingerprints or other methods. In Bosnia, there were lack of antemortem medical and dental records, commingling in secondary mass graves, and time elapsed since the death of the victims, but it relied more on the DNA rather than the other primary identifiers like fingerprints or odontology. In Thailand, dental-based identification could be made for many of the foreign victims relatively rapidly, and the bodies were not fragmented, so it could remove the requirement of DNA-based analysis. And because the bodies were not fragmented, or if the bodies were not skeletonized, fingerprint analysis was also successful in this case. Now, this we talked about like how the process of disaster victim identification works. I have not gone into the detail of the whole process or how it is done. Like just to have a overview or an idea that which all techniques are involved under disaster victim identification. Now, another aspect when we talk about disaster victim identification is the humanitarian aspect, or you would have heard about humanitarian forensics or humanitarian forensic action. That is, though the person has died and may not mean something to an unknown person, but the most difficult aspect in case of a disaster is the management of the dead. That is how those dead bodies or how those dead remains are to be managed. Now, for example, if we talk about the pandemic, the first wave of COVID, when the bodies were not, the dead people, the bodies were not given to the family members and they were cremated or burnt by the hospital authorities, or they were burnt in a mass. So the one of the major question or the sentiment that was raised was how were the bodies disposed of in a proper way, or were they cremated, were they burned, or were their religious sentiments were fulfilled or not? All these were the questions raised. So in even in a mass disaster site, maybe a man-made or an natural, uh, the most important aspect is the how the dead bodies are to be managed. So how they are recovered, as well as unless and until they are identified or they are handed over to their family members, how they are properly stored so that they are not destroyed. Disposal of the dead is the final step in the management of the dead. It is a highly sensitive and a very important step because of cultural, ethnic, and religious sensitivities varying from community to community. So, like different communities or from people from different cultural background or ethnic background, uh, it is important that this aspect of humanitarian forensic is taken into consideration. Now, from this aspect, other than determining the cause, it is the priority of the forensic scientist to identify the deceased, to know the whereabouts of the missing, and dignified disposal, resolving the issues in case of misplaced identity. So, using the scientific basis for identification, it is important that the issues, if there are certain issues regarding the misplaced identity, that should be informed and it should be resolved. Now, if we look at this figure, these are some of the pictures from the different natural disasters. This first picture, the recent Syria-Turkey earthquake. Again, see, if we look at this, or the second picture, if we talk about, this is the pandemic, COVID, how the dead bodies were burned in a mass. And this third one, this is a picture of the tsunami, 2004 tsunami. And the fourth is the flash floods at Kedarnath in Uttarakhand. So if we just have have a look at all these different disaster sites, it is how difficult it is for the personals also who are working in this field to manage. So for this, like an unsystematic approach or an unscientific approach would lead nowhere. So adopting certain scientific methods or adopting the rules that are laid down or the protocols, like from country to country, certain rules and regulations may vary, but then forming up an anti-mortem team to collect the anti-mortem data or forming a post-mortem team to obtain the post-mortem data. So, as if in a proper systematic manner these are done, then it may increase or it will increase the effectiveness of this disaster victim identification. Plus, like we are here talking about disaster victim identification, but a major role has to be played, identifying the possible cause of disasters and to take proactive measures so that these disasters may be avoided or to reduce or to minimize the loss uh, that may occur. Now, for example, when from the weather departments, if the information is given that there are chances that a flood may be there at so and so place, so evacuation is the possible way to minimize the human loss. Similarly, in different places or depending upon the chances of have a particular disaster, or what proactive measures can be taken should be considered. Now, to conclude, due to the hazardous consequences of mass fatality incident, it is a necessity to identify the accused sensitively so as to provide judicial assurance and a support to the family members. And like I talked about, here we are not incorporating, when we're talking about disaster victim identification, we are not incorporating a single aspect. So I haven't dealt with these all other aspects. Like if we, example, we say forensic medicine. So what do we do under that area is we are determining the cause of death. We are determining the cause of death, or we are determining a certain examining the injuries, the nature of injuries, or the possible, or after the changes that occur in the body after the death. So skeletonization or decomposition or mummification, all these changes. So here we cannot ident in any possible way. It is not feasible at all that if we engage or if we take into consideration just one aspect. Now, for example, we have certain dead remains, and like on the basis of preparing the biological profile, we, unless and until we incorporate radiology into it, or if we are incorporating odontology into it, the exact identification isn't possible. So that is why it works in an interdisciplinary manner, engaging the services of experts in various disciplines comprising forensic medicine, pathologist, anthropologist, odontologist, radiologist, fingerprint, and DNA experts to substitute the work in the examination of victims. So all these different areas, or we say for the which are useful in identification and should be incorporated. In accordance to the internationally recognized Interpol DBI guide, the basic quality of standards should be maintained, and these dead should be treated with dignity and respect. So the whatever the like standard operating procedures are there to deal with the dead remains, or for in during the process of identification, however it is, they should be treated with dignity and respect. So, like when we say Interpol, that is International Police Organization. So, in India, like after this earthquake that occurred in Bhuj and this flash floods, this uh, Disaster Management Act was enacted in 2005, so that like in, because in India even there are so many natural disasters that are taking place. So after that, a National Disaster Management Authority was framed, and then within the states, state disaster management authorities were framed, so that a proper protocol within state or within the nation are to be followed for the proper action that should be taken at a disaster site, as well as in the identification of the victim. So that's all from my end. If there are questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, ma'am, for the engaging and profound session. Ma'am, we have gathered questions from our students. We will read them to you one by one and ask you to respond.
Sure.
Ma'am, one question from the student is, like if a disaster has happened in the India or in the country, then which authority is responsible to take up the task of disaster victim identification in India?
Like I told you, this Disaster Management Act was enacted. So, like there are separate authorities, including the police personals. So, both the state government and the the central government works into play. Plus, there are NDRFs, disaster response, National Disaster Response Force, as well as the investigating teams are framed so that they visit the site for recovery. See, first important thing that comes into play is if there are alive victims. Like for an example, in case of earthquakes, we read in the news that After a few days also, the certain alive individuals are evacuated from the scene. So providing the medical assistance or saving them, plus then identifying the victims. So like soon after the disaster, we don't get remains. So providing the medical assistance or whatever possible way of identification or provide those to the family members.
Ma'am, the another question is that the students want to know that is there any national or local guidelines which have been assigned for this disaster victim identification?
Yes, there are guidelines. See, Interpol, under this, there are many countries, more than 150 nations are there. So there are standard guidelines or protocols that in this manner, a disaster site should be looked for. So when I told you about like obtaining the antemortem data, so there are certain fixed set of questions that should be like other than having it from the databases, fixed set of questions that should be asked to the family members. Like if we are talking about if there are the person would have a prior dental checkup, so if the scans are available, or how the age, regarding the age of a person or the clothing of a person. So there are guidelines that should be followed. See, if we say Interpol or the international guidelines that are there, but still like due to the variations in the laws in a country, so certain guidelines are restricted within the country boundaries. Plus, if it is like if we talk about the tsunamis, so not only India but other countries were also affected. Now, if we talk about earthquakes, this the recent one, so there was not a single country which was affected. So altogether, when such a natural disasters where different nations or like, or for example, in pandemic, COVID pandemic, the whole world was affected. So the guidelines were there. So the same rules plus the particular country's guidelines still that works within the country.
Ma'am, one last question. Is
Yes.
there any limitation for this disaster victim identification? Like, what are the things a person has to keep it in mind before like doing this identification or proceeding with the procedure of this?
Like you mean to ask from the perspective of a personnel who is investigating?
Yes, yes. Like, any
All right.
limitation for this thing?
Yeah, limitations as in like if as I've explained, different methods that were used for this identification. So limitation as in due to the unavailability of a particular method, like for example, where fingerprints are not available, or whatever record is available or what is not available. So now if in case of fragmented remains, the limitation is sorry, the limitation is it is not possible to obtain, just a minute. Yeah, sorry for the interruption. The limitation is like the availability of the resources or the evidence, we can say. What material, what evidence can you recover, and is it possible to make an accurate identification or not, or to what extent information can be obtained from that particular evidence. Like from that aspect, these are the few limitations. Like uh, even though we are not we are aware that fragmented remains DNA may be obtained, though in small quantity, but DNA may be obtained. That may be helpful in identification. But in case of mass disasters, it will not be possible to go for DNA analysis.
Thank you, ma'am, for patiently answering our questions. Let us be grateful to the people who make us happy. They are the charming gardeners who make our souls blossom. With these thoughts in mind, I invite Dr. Suchita Rawat to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Gaining knowledge is the first step of wisdom. Sharing it is the first step to humanity. On this note, we sincerely thank Ms. Hansi Bansal for taking out time from your busy schedule and delivering an online lecture. We also thank ma'am for preponing the lecture in view of the national level intercollegiate fest in Questa. It was a pleasure to listen to you, ma'am. It was clear that your presentation captivated everyone in attendance. And ma'am, I'm very confident that your exhaustively covered lecture and insights will be extremely beneficial to our students. Best wishes for your good health and success in all your future endeavors. This session would not have been possible without the support and guidance of the member of management led by Principal Reverend Father Dr. Augustine George and Vice Principal Reverend Father Lijopi Thomas. Thank you, fathers. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Calistius Jude, Dean, Faculty of Sciences, Christo Jayanti College, for encouraging us to strive better and helping us in conducting such programs. Thank you, sir. I also extend my gratitude to Professor Don Cairo, Coordinator of Department of Forensic Science. Sir, we are very grateful for everything that you have done for the department, and it is an honor to put your guidance into practice every day. The smooth conduct of the guest lecture is because of the faculty members of the Department of Forensic Science. I thank all the dear teachers for coordinating the program and making it a big success. I also thank all the students for being a great audience, for the patient listening and asking their doubt in order to make the session interactive. Thank you, dear students. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, ma'am. A feedback link will be sent to your WhatsApp groups. Student participants can fill the feedback form. I request all of you to fill the form without fail.
Thank you so much for this platform and sharing my lecture. I hope the students would have benefited to some extent from the lecture.
To a great extent, ma'am. Thank you.
It is good to see you, Jeremiah Justice, a friend of mine. Good to see you, Jerry.
Thank you. The lecture was very well done, and thank you for your time also. Thank you so
And
much.
like if there are any further questions, like due to time constraints, I had limited my presentation. So like if there are any further questions, it can be mailed or whatever way you wish to answer. I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, ma'am. So we'll end the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.